to hear back from this other person.
Oh, okay.
There it is. It says, I'm consenting to being recorded. When you, that reminds me that when you start the meeting, make sure you let people know that it's being recorded and for what purpose.
Okay.
Hello.
Oh, how are you?
I'm good. Lauren, hello. I see Emily, Trish, how are you? Madison, hi.
Hello.
So, Trish, I have an idea for a movie spoof I'm trying to get my husband on board for, which is like The Blob, except it would be called The Cob, and it's like popcorn and a corn cob that becomes the monster. But I was trying to convince him to go in because I live in Silver Spring and there's a movie theater in our neighborhood, you know, AFI, that looks like an old timey movie theater. So I was like, we should go film ourselves running away from the theater because it's closed right now.
I love it.
That's a B-roll. Yeah, he's not sold yet.
He's not into it yet. Give it time.
I think he doesn't. He needs a vision.
So I think we have everyone on. Thanks everyone for joining on time. So this is our second steering committee meeting for this project with NAC and Adira. We'll be scheduling meetings for November, December, and January. But this meeting is actually going to be recorded, so just keep that in mind. And I'm going to pass the baton to Grace to welcome the group.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. So I was thinking we could just do, I would love to hear, because we've been seeing more and more as we approach Family Caregivers Month, like the big issues that are facing caregivers. So I'd love for us to just sort of warm up our voices, so to speak, by just sharing one of the issues that you've noticed lately in the news, in your own life, in your organizations. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is this sense of just COVID fatigue in general. So that in general, you know, it takes longer to do things like get up, go to the store, or put your mask on, and, you know, finding parking, like all of these, this sort of uncertainty that I think is really contributing to sort of people feeling burnt out, and how much more magnified that probably is for caregivers. So I'm gonna pass the baton to this way, which is, well, Greg would be next.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I mean, I think that I think the weather and the isolation is, it's going to be, it's already becoming, I think, a bit of something to fear. I mean, just talking to my mother, who is struggling quite a bit with isolation, everything is magnified, even if the weather hasn't really caught up with where we think it's going to be, in a couple of weeks. It's quite nice now, but I think that her mood has already plummeted in expectation that things are going to be rough. I can only imagine what other people in a similar situation are expecting or planning on, and already sort of feeling a bit depressed by it.
That's great. Lauren Ruiz.
It is insurance season and Medicare open enrollment just started. And I know that many of the people that rely on services to help with guidance for that are struggling to find the same level of service this year, because many of the organizations that provide those services rely on volunteers, many of whom are older themselves, and they're not able to go into the normal locations where they would be meeting with people face to face. And they're not as astute at handling necessarily some of the technology that is required right now to do some of these visits not in person. And so I have heard that it is reducing some access to help with things like enrolling in Medicare, changing Medicare plans, and of course, the Affordable Care Act open enrollment is coming up as well. And there is a lot of confusion about just what is going on with that health law and what will be available to people. And again, where to access that type of help, because many of those professional advocates are, as I said, volunteers in some cases. And there's been a big dip in some of the volunteer activity that these organizations have been able to maintain over the last 6 months.
Thanks, Lauren. Marilyn, you're next on my Hollywood Squares.
Well, I guess what I'm most struck by is I have a great aunt who is in a nursing home facility, and every Tuesday I call her, and her caregiver shares the phone with me and Lucy to talk. And I've noticed over the course of weeks how anxious both my aunt is and the caregiver is. And I think it's the fatigue of being, feeling isolated. I think it's the concern from the caregiver point of view of, am I remaining safe personally? And am I keeping Lucy safe? That I can tell by just the questions and the conversation I have with her caregiver, Pam. So to me, the longer we experience the pandemic, the less that we feel confident that it's being addressed in any particular way that gives us hope and encouragement. I think the harder it is on the people who are caring for those who are so fragile. And that's what I hear every Tuesday.
Thanks, Marilyn. Maddie?
Oh, sorry, I always have to find the unmute button. I think the thing that I'm most concerned about hearing in the news too right now, especially, is the politics around all like the stimulus and what's going to happen next. I think especially like small businesses and people are starting to get like really concerned with the upcoming election and how it's going to impact almost everything about their life. So it's always a fun thought.
I know it's top of mind for a lot of us, particularly in Washington. Emily.
It's not a lot of, it's everybody.
Yeah, I think a lot of tension between people and just interpersonal frustrations. And like Greg was saying, especially worried as the weather's getting worse, and especially for caregivers who live with the person that they care for, and the kind of tension and stress that can build up in that dynamic when you really can't get a break as easily as you used to be able to. And just kind of that, not quite resentment, but I think some aspect of resentment and some, burden and feeling like, am I doing a good enough job? Can I do a good enough job for both myself and the person that I'm caring for?
Yeah. Trish.
There's a whole bunch of fire engines going past right now. I'm going to shut my window. Go to somebody else. I'll come back.
Okay. Lily.
So this is actually, it's not direct about caregivers, but it impacts caregivers certainly. I just opened I'm on the health exchange as an independent consultant. So I buy my own health insurance, and I am currently paying a $680 a month monthly premium, and just got a letter that it's going to be going up to $818 a month next year, which is just absolutely bananas to me, and speaks to the healthcare cost and the burden that so many patients and caregivers are facing. And I was particularly disappointed to see that, given that there's a lot of insurance companies that have record year numbers and profits. So just healthcare costs continue to remain a major issue for our patients and caregivers. And I'm really concerned about that, and especially with the election coming up too.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. David.
Yeah, so all great perspectives and observations. Something I've noticed in the clinical research space is so many studies or so many trials have been put on hold. And so what our team has more recently been receiving is like questions on when these trials are going to be up and running, in particular caregivers reaching out. There's a lot of anticipation for getting these studies that were put on hold just up and getting treatment for patients, getting them back on track essentially. In addition to everything else that was shared already, I think that it just goes to show that so many people are being affected by the pandemic, and in particular, caregivers having to cope with their own personal issues in addition to caring for others. So, yeah.
Thank you. Jennifer.
I will piggyback off of all of the comments about caregiver fatigue during the pandemic. Something that is an additional layer of that is that things that come up in my support group every month since this has started is caregivers who live in with the person that they care for don't know who to trust as far as information on when things are safe. So they're living still at stage 0 while the city around them or the town around them starts to evolve and people are going outside or to stores or getting takeout. They're not leaving the house because they're too concerned about bringing something in to the person that they care for. And they always say, we don't know when it's okay. We don't know what information source to trust. Is it when there's a vaccine? How do we know the vaccine is safe? Like there's just this mistrust of any information about their own particular home situations.
Trish.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. There's it sounded like 20 trucks going past the house. So one thing that I think I wanted to share was I was pleased that today GSA, our annual scientific meeting, is sort of going on from the beginning of October till the end of November, when it's actually advertised as the 3rd to the 7th of November. but the Family Caregiving Interest Group met today, so via Zoom. So that's always kind of a, for me, kind of reinvigorating, because we are hearing about, I mean, there are issues that people are having where their research has been halted, but also the creative ways that people are thinking about how to move forward with their research it's just inspiring to me when I hear about that. And then just because of Jennifer's last comment, we recently released a decision tool for people to think about when to go out. And that's one of those things that I think we have found that, at least through our membership, as they're sharing that with people, it's helpful because it's for consumers, right? It's not at a research level, it's at the level that, you know, I tested it with my dad for him to be able to use it. So I can share that with Grace to share around with you all. But I do hear from family members about the burden of caregiving feeling a little bit heavier right now. And I keep trying to say, well, something's going to come. There's really coming. We're all here to help. So try to balance it so that, especially for my family, so especially for some of my family members, that they know that there are ways to find some help.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for sharing those thoughts. I was taking notes here, and I'm hearing this group talk about, you know, fatigue, the impact of changing seasons and isolation, navigating healthcare issues, whether that's facility-based care, paying for insurance, figuring out how to get involved with Medicare and other type payers, and then some of the political forces that are sort of in the background of all of our lives right now. And the sense of being able to take a break, like not just respite, but also like, when can I go out? When can I get my hair cut or go to the dentist? So thanks for helping us sort of contextualize today's work. So Charlotte, I'm going to hand it over to you to walk us through the agenda. And you're welcome to share if there's anything, because I think you got missed on the Hollywood Squares.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to echo everyone's thoughts. I think those are all really important points. So thank you for sharing. So today we have 3 meeting objectives. And what we'd like to do today is get some group consensus on the microsite name and design so that we can get that up and running and start to build out this first phase of the project. The second objective is to get your feedback on a process for vetting resources that are submitted to the microsite. And finally, we'd like to update you on the COVID-19 framework. We'll also leave some time at the end to discuss next steps and answer any questions that you all might have about next steps. So let's get right to that first objective. About a week back, I sent out some updated mock-ups on the logo and site layout that our designer made based on our last steering committee meeting. And I was wondering if anyone had any discussion items they like to bring up in regards to that.
And Charlotte, do you have them? Do you want to pop them up on the screen?
Yeah, sure. I'll pop those up. Just give me a second. While I'm waiting to pop those up, Maddie, I'm going to pick on the feedback that you had sent me last week. You mentioned that you preferred the site being called Take Care, with the Care Lab as an entry point in the site, because you Googled both Take Care and the Care Lab and found that there are already a lot of sites called the Care Lab, and we'd want to avoid, you know, sites getting mixed up. So does anyone else have an opinion on the site being called Take Care as opposed to the Care Lab? And then the entry point would be the Care Lab. Hold on, let me show what that would look like. So this is the okay, here it is. Okay, so this is what that would look like. So it would be called Take Care, and then there would be an entry point towards the bottom, and you would click on it, and that would be called the Care Lab. And that's where there would be resources that people submitted. Okay. The other option that we discussed last week was having the site being called the Care Lab. Any thoughts on that? Okay.
Does anyone have very strong feelings one way or the other? Trish, go for it.
So I wouldn't say it's a strong feeling, but I want to say that I appreciate that in the photo, even though the person has supports for walking and there's a wheelchair there, they're happy, as opposed to, so I work on that Reframing Aging initiative, and we know that wheelchairs and walkers and all could be helpful for somebody to be successful and to be able to do what they want, as opposed to somebody who just looks very sad and frail. So I like that. I like that picture. I like that photo for that reason.
Thanks for mentioning
You
that.
know, there are resources that help you be where you want to be in, you know, in life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Others
that's a
have
good
strong feelings.
This isn't really a strong feeling, but I did have a question. So at the Care Lab, there's a tagline, helping you take care. Charlotte, does Take Care have a tagline to it? Because I couldn't remember if it did or not.
We didn't, because, so I think that the tagline idea for the Care Lab came up because we were trying to combine the two ideas of Take Care and the Care Lab, but no, we don't have one for the other way around.
Okay. And the Take Care, the first slide you just showed had a symbol of the heart. Didn't it also have one of hands, two hands?
Yes. So that's a good point, Marilyn. Does anyone have any opinion on the logos? So I'll show the logo options again. So yeah, so is this the one you were talking about, Marilyn, the one with the two hands? Yeah. So I think it was Jennifer Levin, you mentioned last time we talked that you felt like this was a little bit more gender neutral than this logo, which I think is a good point. So
responding to that, even as we
Yeah.
look at it again.
Okay. Does anyone else have any objection if we go with this logo option with the two hands?
That's my personal favorite. Not that
Mine too,
I like
actually.
all of them. What's that?
That's mine too, actually, as well. I think it's, the symmetry is nice. It looks hip. And the hands are partnered, which I like too, because it's like a partnership between the person and the caregiver versus like, I'm giving you a thing or.
Cool.
May I ask a clarifying question too? So this is going to be housed where? I mean, where's the link? Where's the original? Because I just checked, for example, takecare.org is taken.
Mhm.
So do we have to worry about trademarking? I mean, what's your sense on people confusing this with other
Right.
take care campaigns?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And there was the same issue that Maddie raised with the Care Lab. It seems like if you just search the Care Lab or Take Care, options already show up. But I think there are ways that we can get our website to the top of that search result. Like, I'm not 100% sure, but Grace, do you remember that being the case?
Well, so yeah, and we had both Kelly Yoder on the Adira Foundation team and our web guy look at different URL options. So I think we can make it work in terms of the site branding. And I'm thinking that's something maybe we can circle around after this call if we've got a firm decision on we like the hands, we like the name of the project, and then we can get Stephen to start building it out and then give us some options in terms of URL, if y'all are comfortable with that.
Cool. Awesome. Okay. So moving right along to our next meeting objective, which is to go through the resource submissions process. So I sent you all of this working document we're using to develop the process for getting resource submissions. And just to remind you all, what we really want in this website is to have a space where people can recommend resources, and then we vet them in kind of a Wikipedia-like process. So this first section here is the content of a form that individuals would fill out when they would like to submit a resource to the microsite. So these are the questions that we thought we should ask. Does anyone have any initial feedback on this? Would you add, delete, or modify anything? And I'll just add that what we're really trying to get from this form is where the source is coming from, and if the individual submitting it has any kind of underlying reason for submitting it. So if it's like a business, like a commercial interest, as we mentioned here, we probably would want to be aware of that. But also wanting the resource to be in line with what we're trying to do with this project.
I see, Charlotte, that we're asking for a link or an upload of the resource. Do we just ask them to name the resource as well separately?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
If somebody uploads a resource it might be a little bit different than something that's a website, making sure that whoever uploads the resource, there's no copyright issues.
Okay.
I don't know the official way to ask that. I can ask our publications.
Yeah, that's a good point. We'd want to, if we do include any resources we include, we definitely want to acknowledge whoever the author is. So I think that's a good point, yeah.
That could be a question that goes along with number 5, Charlotte, about who published the resource, is who has ownership of the resource as well.
Right.
So, if things are, like you said, Charlotte, leading to a commercial, if there's a commercial interest and not a community interest,
right.
say, what do I'm presuming, but perhaps I shouldn't, that we either want to minimize or eliminate strictly commercial interests. Is that right? Maybe we need to be clear about how we, what our no-goes are up front. I mean, and if we do want to allow for commercial interests, do we want to sort of sequester them to a particular another part of the site?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it kind of goes into the second part, which is how we're vetting resources. So Grace and I thought of the idea of kind of tiering things. So a tier 1 resource would be one that's completely free. So maybe what you're saying is that if there is some sort of commercial interest, if it does have a price, it would be more of a bottom tier resource. But that's definitely something we want to consider.
And I wonder if that's a place. I think that's a place where, as a committee, it'd be helpful to know what you're thinking, because I don't want to assume that just because something, this is like the great for-profit, not-for-profit debate, like just by virtue of being a for-profit enterprise does not mean that people are creating things that are not valuable. But I think part of this is letting caregivers know, is almost like a disclosure, like you would in a research setting, this is a great resource, but you should know it's going to cost money, and or the company that's putting out the resource, that this is a sort of a marketing thing. But I'd love to know what others think on the committee, if that makes sense to you guys.
Grace, that does. And I guess I'll speak from, I wear a few different hats, but if we're talking about, from Clara's perspective, and Clara is sitting on this committee, granted, we are sitting from with our World Without COVID hat on, which is a public health initiative. And so we are not monetizing on that, but Clara Health is a health tech company. We are for profit. We do make money from pharmaceutical and biotech companies to help them recruit. But I also like to think that we do a lot of good work helping patients find trials for free, even if we're not getting paid. So I think we would be a good example of a for-profit entity that is doing good and would be a valuable resource. And I think that it would make sense to include, but to your point, maybe with some level of a disclaimer.
And I think that's it, Lily. It wasn't just putting any particular disdain or contempt for commercial products, just so long as there's transparency around it, and that there is. And I tell you, part of where this came from, I listened to. It's a shame you're recording this but I was listening to Planet Money on NPR, and there was this whole episode about how all these different people that make chocolate managed to coerce this fake study to get implemented and quote unquote peer reviewed and put up into these journals that chocolate was good for your health. And so there can be all these, sidestep ways that commercial entities can present themselves as solid research institutions, or, and it is trying to do our best to vet and be quite clear about, either preventing those kinds of offerings that are, not transparent to this microsite, or just labeling them as such.
You're crushing my soul to tell me before Halloween that chocolate is not good for my health.
Sorry. Get that Planet Money link.
Maybe something that would be helpful to include in the microsite is like a paragraph kind of explaining what our intention is for these resources.
Mhm.
And that might kind of filter out those things a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd like to include for users kind of like an FAQ of, exactly what we're talking about today. How did we vet these resources? What does that process look like? And I agree with Lily and Greg's comments about tiering these. I think that's a good idea to kind of categorize them. And while we do prefer free resources, I think there is sometimes a misconception or an assumption that everyone dealing with a chronic disease struggles financially. And while that is the case for many, it's not the case for all. And I have spoken to many caregivers who are happy to pay for a service or a resource if they feel that it is benefiting their loved one. So I certainly don't want to not include resources that can be very useful for those consumers who can access that.
Right.
But I would
Jennifer,
like,
do you
as
have
Greg
thoughts
said,
on-
to just be really transparent about that.
Jennifer, I'm wondering what your thoughts are, especially given your role as sort of a caregiver advocate and working with caregivers.
Yeah, I've been kind of grappling in my mind while I'm listening to everybody because we get hit up a lot in my group with people advertising everything from studies from public relations organizations. But then I look at the sample because they're just kind of like selling these statistics, and I look at the sample and I see that there's no like geographic variance. Like it doesn't seem like a very like academic study. So we get all sorts of things, and I'm just reading through these like the process for submitting and knowing that a lot of the resources that we get approached by are caregiving coaches that I never know like what their qualifications are, if this is somebody that just decided last week to branch out into this, or like what exactly they're offering, or if they're like just if they're qualified at all. And these are one of those services that someone easily would want to pay for, as you mentioned, Lauren, but like how do you quantify whether that's a good resource or not? It's something that I just, I even sitting here, I'm like, I don't know. And I think about this constantly. So
that's a really good point, Jennifer. Yeah. And it goes to the process for submitting resources. Can we ask something about how they're measuring the success or impact of the resource, or if they're measuring outcomes on it at all? So that if there is evidence that someone can look at to see, is this a successful resource? What kind of impact is this having on its users, that we could provide that information or link them to that information as well? That, Jennifer, like you said, that's exactly it. We can get a submission of all of these resources. We can vet it from an organization that even is a well-known organization. How do we know that the resource itself is useful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to speak a little bit back on the commercial interest question, number 9. Since it's a yes or no question, and if we're looking to vet specifically what kind of commercial interest, I would suggest adding an additional question, like an open-ended question, asking like specifically what their commercial interest is, if they answer yes or no. Just a thought to kind of make it a little bit easier when they do submit something like this, that there's already a little bit of background information.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And going back to the evidence kind of based, how we're figuring out if resources are helpful or not. It's so in this part of the process is a checklist that we would use to vet recommendations that we get. So thinking about, is it coming from a credible author or source, like a nonprofit, government, or university, but it could also be coming from any other number of sources. So I think we need to kind of expand that a little bit.
And I get, but Are we going to start with, will it say credible author? I mean, because I'm not sure, will we have capacity to keep modifier credible? I'm just wondering how we would be able to decide that. And is there capacity for somebody to decide that? That's all. It's just the word. It's probably the word, and maybe we shouldn't go so deep into wordsmithing. But
yeah, we don't have to necessarily keep that word.
Right, because if we turn somebody down,
Right.
you know, I'm looking at the other end of this when you have to send the message that says thanks so much, but we've determined that we're not going to post this. And you're not a credible author.
Reject.
Well,
I'm just thinking of the other end. That's all.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point. Because we could potentially reject something that is coming from a credible author, but that it doesn't focus on one of these other things. So I think the point is that it needs to hit every single one of those things in order to be published onto the website, if that makes sense.
And I think too, you know, from a sort of Wikipedia perspective, one of the things we were thinking about is it would be good for, like if something comes across and it is good, that maybe we have a list of sort of non-vetted resources that, you know, people can peruse as they like. But that part of this is reducing the amount of decisions a caregiver would have to make as to which, you know, how many things do I have to look at, but instead picking some high quality ones in those 3 tiers.
Right. So that's a good point. So I don't know that we would necessarily tell the person we're not going to include this, but that we would just include it somewhere else in the website.
You know, I'm working on another project similar to, it's like a COVID-19 resource for the transplant community. And what we kind of say is that we sort of make no promises, and it's like, you can submit, I can look for the language, whatever we came up with, but basically that, you know, just because you submit does not guarantee that your resource is going to be added. And so probably having language like that somewhere might help. And so that you guys don't have the burden of also having to respond to every person who sends something in.
Yeah.
So I think we would be asking more questions about some of the elements of what I see as a credible source, rather than just blanket accepting all nonprofit, all government, etc. So some of the things that I think, if I was trying to determine if it was a credible source, I would want to see, is this affiliated with an organization or an individual? And can I identify who that is? Not anonymous sources, for example. I would want to see what type of public platform they have. Do they have a website? Do they have social media? Do they have LinkedIn? Do they have reviews? People who have used their service? That's going to lend credibility versus, you know, a blog post that is someone's personal blog. To your point, Jennifer, you know, at that point, how are you validating their credibility? So I think in that section, I would just try to think about, if I was looking at a resource and trying to determine, do I think this is a credible resource? What type of information will I try to find out about it to make that determination?
Right.
So let me just play devil's advocate for a second. Let's say that we put out a press release, we tell people we're doing this, and now all of a sudden we have like 3 million people putting in resources. You know, I think part of this is to have an initial process to look at those resources, and then have, you know, to sort of immediately screen things out, and then have additional sort of looking at those resources once they're submitted. So I'm wondering how much we want to put in sort of the screener tool versus, like, as we review it afterwards, we would say like, okay, yeah, this looked really good, but it turns out it's like, you know, a 12-year-old or something on YouTube, and this is like, no, they don't know anything about this.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Grace. Something else we wanted to ask you all is if we were going to have this tiering, what would be a tier 2 resource or a tier 3 resource? What would, in other words, if we had all the same criteria that's in tier 1 but in tier 2, what would we have to remove to make it a second tier resource? Would it have a price attached to it? Would it come from maybe a less credible author? What are people's thoughts on that?
For me, at least the way that I vet resources for my group is price. Like I created like a sister group because we have so many people that approach us, and I only allow free resources there because everybody is young in my group and mostly strapped for money when it comes to caregiving. But like Lauren mentioned, a lot of people are willing to pay for a resource that would really help them out. I think once you start getting into the like less credible categories, then it's kind of like, then you become like the dark web. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
It just feels like, why bother like presenting somebody with that information if it comes from like a sketchy source?
Mm-hmm.
If I might suggest, you could not try to over police this. You could just allow there to be like National Alliance of Caregiving best picks, like find a way of starring them, or, Airbnb, Prime Host, what are they called? Superhost.
Yeah.
You can do it in such a way that you're not trying to overly stratify. Who's going to have time to vet all that?
Right.
And then who's going to be someone there, whoever it is, they're going to be yelled at for policing this in the wrong way.
Right.
Somebody's going to be upset. So if you just end up focusing more on starring the ones that you feel are particularly exceptional, or the ones you want to steer people towards,
Okay.
that might be an option. And then another thing I maybe would like us to discuss is trying to put these on the site in the way that people would want to navigate through them, like not tiering them in things that as we are putting them on there, but rather how someone, like if I'm millennial, if I'm one of Jennifer's friends, and lucky to be one of Jennifer's friends, maybe they're millennials, I don't know, but they're probably thinking, how can I find things that are for people my age?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how that would be starred on the site, but I'm trying to stratify them on the microsite in ways that someone that comes to the site would find it most easiest to navigate.
Right.
Yeah, I like that idea, Greg, of thinking about how people are going to want to search for things. So Jennifer, you've identified for your group that they are primarily leaning toward free services. So, highlight those things and allow people that know when they go into a big resource of stuff, they want to only see the free stuff, and they know that right away. I think since all of these resources are really supposed to be geared toward caregivers, thinking about how they're going to access them and actually utilize them within the framework of their day-to-day lives might be a good way to go about that. So you could have things like self-guided resources where you're more doing the activities, and maybe it's something you can start and stop, versus like a group-based resource or a web-based resource or some, kind of how you're accessing it or how you're utilizing it. Because I think in many ways for a caregiver, that's some of the information that they want to know when they're accessing a resource is, how am I going to be able to use this? And is this something that is going to mesh with how I take in information and how I learn and how I can apply this to me? Thinking about those categories.
Charlotte, I just wanted to
We can
add.
still have all that other information as the description, et cetera, for each resource.
I just wanted to add to that. When Greg was speaking and also Lauren, it seemed to me that was very, leaning into audiences. And one of the things I was thinking of when we are talking about credible, resources, there may be in tier 2, there may be some resources that are credible but limited. Like they're so focused on one particular area, they have such a specialty that would it be, something that the greater audience would look at, or is it a specialty that, maybe one would look at more so? So it could be, that could also be a disqualifier for a tier 1 versus a tier 2, if you're looking at those kinds of elements. Like when Jennifer talked about, caregiver coaches, which I've never even heard of. Are they certified? Are they to a specific, caregiving kind of system? I don't know, but it seems to me that would be like an example of somebody who has this exclusive set of skills that's looking to market, if you will.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thought that I had about categorizing things like that is the issue of gatekeeping. So we don't, if somebody's looking for like a resource to help them be a better caregiver, I don't want to steer them away from resources that might help them take care of themselves as a caregiver. So making sure that there's like one place where they can access all the resources without going to specific categories, or I don't know what the solution to that would be.
So I just want to, and I'm looking at the time here, I think that's a good point, Charlotte. And I think part of, the other piece of this project is the work around the caregiving framework. And I think the idea is that this framework will give us a sense of how to map these types of resources in the way that somebody might approach them. And in addition to this group, we'll be reaching out to a number of entrepreneurs who work around caregiving apps and sort of decision-making tools to get their feedback. Y'all have probably seen, Charlotte, would it be okay if I steal this for just a second, the screen sharing?
Go ahead.
So this isn't a version that I have an update I'm working on sending to Julie, but this sort of the impact of COVID-19 on the care journey and the list of caregiving activities. And I think the idea is ultimately on this list of caregiving activities, that's how people would approach the site. And I like the idea of maybe even adding a filter or something so that you could say, where can I find resources on coordinating care? And then, under the bucket of coordinating care, filter by, filter by the cost, or filter by whether it was a not-for-profit or a for-profit, those kinds of things. And so both this piece and the other, an updated version of this, will go out to the community for their feedback, as well as when I get it back from Julie, to you guys to provide your input. I will tell you, I'm working as we've gotten feedback from our internal groups. One thing that strikes me is that this care journey could be simplified a little bit. So, and I have doodled a version, but I'm not going to show you all the doodle until Julie works her beautiful magic on it and makes it look real. But I think that second piece, particularly about caregiver activities, is where we want to focus in terms of site navigation and sort of curating. And to some degree, I don't know that we'll fully get around the gatekeeping issue, but I think we want to really think about not just like, what is it that caregivers are doing, but sort of you know, areas where everybody, you know, the resources are going to cluster in that area. So like, for example, if what caregivers are doing is providing emotional support, those psychosocial supports are really going to cluster sort of in that area. Or if they were to get somebody to provide backup to them, it would be in sort of a different area than like, I need help managing medications, for example. So I'm really going to encourage you guys to push us really hard on that second, particularly that second part of the framework, because I think that'll form the foundation of the big site after we've collected all these things. Charlotte, I'm going to toss it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Grace. Yeah, so looking at the clock here, I'm just going to wrap things up, but we're going to be scheduling our next calls for November, December, and January. So look out for that. And if anyone has any questions about next steps or anything, feel free to ask away. Nope.
So one thing I'll say is we'll take this information back and get Stephen to pop up the microsite, and we'll send that around for you guys to look at. And then I'm hoping to get the framework back this week and would love your unfiltered markups on that. And then we'll also have in November a community town hall, and people in your networks, your organizations would be invited to provide feedback on that framework. And then in December, we're going to do a global town hall as part of a larger global carers conference we'll be hosting. So just keep your eyes peeled for those things. Unfortunately, these are all virtual, so we won't get to party in person, but you're welcome to come party virtually with us in your respective homes.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for
Really
joining.
looks good.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Y'all take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.